Chapter 2. They would be in Raccoon City in just under an hour. Nikolai Genovov was prepared, and he believed his squad would do well, better than the rest anyway. The 9 others that had made up Squad B respected him. He had seen it in their eyes, and although they would almost certainly die, their performance would be noteworthy. After all, he had practically trained them himself. There was no talking in the helicopter that carried Platoon D through the late afternoon, not even among the squad leaders, the only personnel that wore headsets. It was too loud for the troops to hear one another, and Nikolai had nothing to say to either Harami or Kryan, or Mikhail Victor, for that matter. Victor was their superior, the commander of the entire platoon. It was a job that should have belonged to Nikolai. Victor lacked the qualities that made up a true leader.
I possess them, though. I was chosen for Watchdog, and when this is all over, I'm the one Umbrella will have to deal with, whether they like it or not.
Nikolai kept his face as stone, but he smiled inside. When the time came, they, the men who controlled Umbrella from behind the scenes, would realize they'd underestimated him. He sat near the A and C squad leaders against one wall of the cabin, soothed by the steady and familiar throb of the transport. The very air was charged with tension and heavy with the scent of masculine sweat. Again familiar. He had led men into battle before, although if everything went as planned, he would never have to again. He let his gaze wander over the taut faces of the troops, wondering if any of them would survive more than an hour or two. It was possible, he supposed. There was the scarred man from South Africa in Kryan's group, and on his own, John Worsbowski, who had taken part in an ethnic cleansing a few years back. Nikolai couldn't remember which one. Both men had the combination of deep suspicion and self-possession that might conceivably allow them to escape Raccoon, however unlikely, and it was unlikely. The briefing hadn't prepared any of them for what was ahead. Nikolai's own private briefing 2 days earlier had been a different matter. Operation Watchdog, they called it. He knew the projected numbers, had been told what to expect and how to most effectively dispatch the unclean, the walking diseased. They told him about the Tyrant Light Seeker units that were going to be sent in, and how to avoid them. He knew more than anyone on the transport.
But I'm also readier than Umbrella can possibly imagine, because I know the names of the other dogs.
Again, he suppressed a smile. He possessed additional information that Umbrella didn't know he had, that was worth a great deal of money, or would be soon enough. On the surface, the UBCS was being sent in to rescue civilians. That was what they had been told anyway. But he was one of the 10 who'd been chosen to gather and record data on the T-virus carriers, human and otherwise, and on how they fared against trained soldiers. The real reason the UBCS was being sent in, aka Watchdog. In the helicopter that carried Platoon A were 2 others disguised as UBCS. There were 6 already planted in Raccoon, 3 scientists, 2 Umbrella paper pushers, and a woman who worked for the city. The 10th was a police officer, a personal assistant to the chief himself. Each of them probably knew 1 or 2 of the others that Umbrella had hand-picked as information collectors. But thanks to his well-developed computer skills and a few borrowed passwords, he was the only one who knew about all of them, as well as where each one was supposed to be to file their reports. Wouldn't their contacts be surprised when they failed to report in? Wouldn't it be amusing if only one watchdog survived and was able to name his price for the information that had been gathered? And wasn't it amazing to think that a man could become a multi-millionaire if he was willing to expand thought, a bit of effort, and a few bullets? 9 people. He was 9 people away from being the only Umbrella employee to have the information they wanted. Most, If not all of the UBCS would die quickly, and then he'd be free to find the other watchdogs, to take their data and end their miserable lives. This time he couldn't help it. Nikolai grinned. The mission that lay ahead promised to be an exciting one, a true test of his many skills, and when it was over, he was going to be a very wealthy man. In spite of the cramped seating and the dull roar of the copter's engines, Carlos was only faintly aware of his surroundings. He couldn't get his mind off of Trent and a decidedly weird conversation they had only a couple of hours ago, and he found that he kept replaying it, trying to decide if any of it was useful. To begin with, Carlos had trusted the guy about as far as he could toss him. The man had been way too happy, not outwardly so much, but Carlos had gotten the definite impression that Trent was laughing about something just beneath the surface. His dark eyes fairly danced with humor as he told Carlos that he had information for him, stepping back into the alley he'd emerged from as if there had been no question Carlos would follow. There hadn't been, really. Carlos had learned to be very careful in his line of work, but he also knew a few things about reading people, and Trent, though obviously strange, hadn't been particularly threatening. The alley had been cool and dark and had smelt faintly of urine. "What kind of information?" Carlos had asked. Trent had acted as though he hadn't heard the question. "In the shopping district downtown, you'll find a diner called Grill 13. It's just up the street from the fountain and right next to the theater. You can't miss it. If you can manage to get there by," he glanced at his watch, "say 1900 hours, I'll see what can be done to help you." Carlos hadn't even known where to start. "Hey, no offense, but what the hell are you talking about?" Trent had smiled. "Raccoon City. It's where you're going." Carlos had stared at him, waiting for more, but Trent had seemed to be finished. "God knows how he got my name, but this Bato ain't playing for full deck." Listen, Mr. Trent." "Just Trent," he cut in, still smiling. Carlos had started to get irritated. "Whatever. I think you might have the wrong Oliviera. And while I appreciate your, concern, I've really got to get going." "Ah, yes, duty calls," Trent had said, his smile fading. "Understand they won't tell you all you need to know. It will be far, far worse. The hours ahead may be dark ones, Mr. Oliviera. But I have faith in your abilities. Just remember, Grill 13, 7 o'clock, northeast corner of the city proper." "Yeah, sure," Carlos had said, nodding, backing away into the daylight, wearing a somewhat forced grin of his own. "Good deal. I'll make a note of it." Trent had smiled again, stepping out after him. "Be very careful who you trust, Mr. Oliviera, and good luck." Carlos had turned and started to walk quickly away, throwing a glance back at Trent. The man had watched him, hands in his pockets again, his stance casual and relaxed. For a nutbag, he sure didn't seem crazy. And he seems a lot less crazy now, eh? Carlos had still made it to the office a little early, but nobody seemed to have heard anything off the grapevine about what was up. At the short briefing presented by the UBCS platoon leaders, they'd all been told what few facts there were. A toxic chemical spill had occurred earlier in the week in an isolated community, causing hallucinations that bred violence. The chemicals had dissipated, but regular civilians continued to be harassed by those who'd been affected. There was evidence that the damage could be permanent, and the local police hadn't been able to get things under control. The UBCS was being sent in to help evacuate the citizens who hadn't been affected, and to use force, if necessary, to protect them from harm. Top secret all the way. In Raccoon City, which meant that maybe Trent knew something, after all. And what did that mean? If he was right about where we're going, what about the rest of it? What didn't they tell us that we need to know? And what could possibly be far, far worse than a mob of deranged and violent people? He didn't know, and he didn't like not knowing. He'd picked up the first gun at the age of 12 to help defend his family from a band of terrorists, and had gone pro at 17. For 4 years now, he'd been paid to put his life in danger for one cause or another. But he'd always known what the stakes were, and what he was up against. This was not at all cool, the thought of going in blind. The only consolation was that he was going in with over 100 experienced soldiers. Whatever it was, they'd be able to handle it. Carlos looked around, thinking that he was with a good group. Not good men necessarily, but adept fighters, way more important in combat. They even looked ready, their eyes hard and watchful, their faces determined, except for the B Squad leader, who was staring off into space, grinning like a shark, like a predator. Carlos was suddenly uneasy, looking at the guy. Nikolai something or other, cropped white hair, built like a weightlifter. He'd never seen anyone smile quite like that. The Russian met his gaze, and his grin widened for just a moment, in a way that made Carlos want to sit with his back to a wall, a gun in hand. And then the moment was over, and Nikolai nodded absently at him and looked away. Just another soldier acknowledging a comrade. Nothing more. He was being paranoid. That meeting with Trent had him on edge, and he was always a little sketchy before a fight. Grill 13, next to the theater. He wouldn't forget, just in case.